Memphis, August 8, 1974. Elvis was reviewing security footage in Graceland's hidden surveillance room when he saw something that made his blood run cold. There, on the black and white monitor, was his most trusted bodyguard, Red West, the man who had protected him since high school, carefully slipping Elvis's personal items into his jacket pocket. What happened in the confrontation that followed would end a 20-year friendship and change Elvis forever. This story reveals one of the most painful betrayals in Elvis Presley's life, and how he handled the heartbreak of discovering that someone he considered family had been stealing from him for months. It's about trust, loyalty, and the devastating moment when you realize the person closest to you has been living a lie. Subscribe to Elvis Presley Legacy Stories, because these hidden chapters show us that even kings can be wounded by those they love most. And if this story resonates with you, share it, because we've all experienced betrayal, and sometimes we need reminders of how to handle it with dignity. August 8, 1974. Graceland was unusually quiet for a Thursday evening. Elvis had just returned from a grueling tour, and most of the Memphis Mafia had gone home to their families, leaving only the essential staff to maintain the mansion's daily operations. Elvis should have been resting, but insomnia had been plaguing him for weeks, and he found himself wandering the halls of his beloved home in the early morning hours. It was during one of these restless nights that Elvis decided to check the security footage in the surveillance room, a hidden space behind the kitchen that few people even knew existed. He had installed the system months earlier, after some valuable items had gone missing from various rooms throughout Graceland. At first, he'd attributed the disappearances to simple misplacement, or perhaps overzealous cleaning staff accidentally moving things. But as more items vanished, a gold watch here, cash there, even some of his prescription medications, Elvis realized something more serious was happening. The surveillance room was cramped, containing 4 black and white monitors that displayed footage from cameras positioned throughout the mansion. Elvis had been reluctant to install the system, feeling it violated the family atmosphere he tried to maintain at Graceland, but recent thefts had left him no choice. As he settled into the chair and began reviewing the previous day's recordings, he had no idea he was about to witness the most devastating betrayal of his life. The first few hours of footage showed the usual activity: Lisa, Marie playing in the living room, Aunt Delta preparing meals in the kitchen, various staff members going about their duties. Elvis fast-forwarded through most of it, looking for anything unusual. Then, at approximately 2:30 p.m. the previous afternoon, he saw something that made him stop the tape and rewind. There, moving carefully through his personal study, was Red West, Elvis's childhood friend, his most trusted bodyguard, the man who had stood by his side through every triumph and crisis for nearly 20 years. But Red wasn't checking for security threats or tidying up the room. He was systematically going through Elvis's desk drawers, and as Elvis watched in growing horror, Red carefully palmed a gold money clip filled with $100 bills and slipped it into his jacket pocket. Elvis stared at the monitor in disbelief, hoping he had misunderstood what he was seeing. But as he continued watching, Red moved to the bookshelf where Elvis kept some of his most prized possessions, gifts from other performers, personal mementos from his career, items of sentimental rather than monetary value. Red selected a small silver harmonica that had belonged to Elvis's mother. Gladys examined it briefly and then tucked it into his other pocket. The betrayal was so complete, so calculated, that Elvis felt physically sick. This wasn't a moment of weakness or a desperate act. It was methodical, practiced, suggesting it had been going on for some time. As Elvis continued reviewing the footage, his worst fears were confirmed. Day after day, the recordings showed Red entering various rooms throughout Graceland and systematically taking items: cash from Elvis's bedroom dresser, jewelry from the bathroom counter, even prescription medication from Elvis's private supply. But what hurt Elvis most wasn't the monetary value of what had been stolen. He could afford to lose money and possessions. What devastated him was the realization that Red West, the man he had trusted with his life countless times, the friend who had been best man at his wedding, had been systematically violating that trust for months, possibly years. Elvis sat in that dark surveillance room until dawn broke over Memphis, watching tape after tape, documenting the full extent of Red's betrayal. By the time the sun came up, Elvis had seen enough evidence to send his oldest friend to prison. But more than anger, what he felt was a profound sadness. loss that cut deeper than any professional disappointment or romantic heartbreak he had ever experienced. Red West had been part of Elvis's life since they were teenagers at Hume's High School. He had protected Elvis from bullies, had been one of the first people to believe in his musical dreams, and had stood by him through the awkward, early days of fame when Elvis was still figuring out how to handle success. Red had saved Elvis from physical assault multiple times, had been his companion during the lonely years when stardom isolated him from normal relationships, and had been more like a brother than an employee. Now Elvis had to face the possibility that this relationship, one of the most important in his life, had been built on a lie, or at least had deteriorated into one. He spent the morning walking through Graceland, looking at his possessions differently, wondering what else had been taken, what other betrayals he might discover. Every room felt contaminated by the knowledge that someone he loved had been stealing from him in his own home. By noon, Elvis had made his decision. He couldn't pretend he hadn't seen the evidence, couldn't continue living with someone he could no longer trust, but he also couldn't bring himself to simply call the police or fire Red without giving him a chance to explain. Despite everything, Red had been family, and family deserved at least the opportunity to account for their actions. Elvis arranged for the confrontation to take place in the meditation room, a small, private space in Graceland where he went to think and pray. He chose this location carefully, wanting the conversation to happen in a space that felt sacred, hoping it might encourage honesty and perhaps even redemption. He asked Joe Esposito to bring Red to the room at 3:10 p.m., telling Joe only that he needed to have a private conversation with Red about security matters. When Red entered the meditation room that afternoon, he was relaxed and jovial, completely unaware that his world was about to collapse. "Hey, boss," he said with the easy familiarity of their long friendship. "Joe said you wanted to see me about something?" Elvis was sitting cross-legged on the floor cushions, his expression grave but controlled. On the low table beside him were several items: the gold money clip, his mother's harmonica, a bottle of pills, and a manila envelope containing printed screenshots from the security footage. Red's eyes immediately went to these objects, and Elvis saw the exact moment when Red realized he had been caught. "Sit down, Red," Elvis said quietly. His voice carried none of its usual warmth, and Red immediately understood that this was not going to be a casual conversation. Red slowly lowered himself onto the cushions across from Elvis, his eyes fixed on the evidence laid out between them. For a long moment, neither man spoke. The silence stretched until it became unbearable, filled with 20 years of shared history and the weight of betrayal. "How long?" Elvis finally asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Red's shoulders sagged as if a massive weight had settled on them. He looked at his hands, then at the items on the table, then finally met Elvis's eyes. What Elvis saw there was not defiance or anger, but shame so profound it was painful to witness. "About 8 months," Red admitted, his voice cracking. "Maybe a little longer." The honesty of the admission somehow made it worse. Elvis had been hoping for denials, for some explanation that would make this all a misunderstanding. Instead, Red's confession confirmed his worst fears. "Why?" Elvis asked, though he wasn't sure he wanted to know the answer. Red was quiet for so long that Elvis wondered if he would answer at all. When he finally spoke, his voice was thick with emotion. "At first it was just small stuff. You had so much, and you were always so generous with everyone else. I told myself you wouldn't even notice a 20 here, a pill there. I told myself it wasn't really stealing, because you would have given it to me if I'd asked. But you didn't ask," Elvis pointed out, his pain evident despite his attempts to remain calm. "No, I didn't ask." Red looked up at Elvis, tears beginning to form in his eyes, "because I knew it wasn't about the money or the things. It was about something else, something I didn't want to admit to myself." "What was it about?" Elvis asked, though he sensed he already knew. Red was crying openly now, 20 years of suppressed emotions finally breaking free. "I was jealous, Elvis. God help me, I was jealous of my best friend. You had everything. The fame, the money, the women, the respect. And what did I have? I was the guy who carried your bags and made sure nobody bothered you. I was living in your shadow, and sometimes I hated it." The confession hit Elvis like a physical blow. He had always tried to treat the Memphis Mafia as friends and equals, had shared his wealth and opportunities with them, had included them in his success. The idea that Red had felt diminished rather than elevated by their relationship was devastating. "So you decided to take what you thought I owed you, Elvis asked, his voice heavy with disappointment. I don't know what I was thinking, Red said desperately. It started so small, and then it just got worse. Every time I took something, I felt terrible about it. But I also felt like I was finally taking control of something in my life. It was stupid and wrong, and I've hated myself for it every single day. But you kept doing it, Elvis observed. I kept doing it, Red admitted, and every day it got harder to stop, because stopping would mean admitting what I'd become. It would mean facing the fact that I'd betrayed the person who meant more to me than anyone else in the world. Elvis stared at his oldest friend, trying to reconcile the man he had known and trusted for 2 decades with the person who had been systematically stealing from him. The Red he thought he knew would never have done this, but the evidence was undeniable, and Red's own admission left no room for doubt. The harmonica, Elvis said, picking up the small silver instrument that had belonged to his mother. That wasn't about money. That was personal. Red broke down completely at the mention of the harmonica. I know it was wrong. I took it because it reminded me of when we were kids, when things were simple between us, before all the fame and the complications. I wanted to have something that connected me to that time. The explanation was so pathetic, so desperately sad, that Elvis felt his anger begin to give way to pity. This wasn't the calculated theft of a criminal. It was the desperate act of a man who felt he was losing his identity and his closest relationship. Red, Elvis said softly. If you had just talked to me about how you were feeling. How could I? Red interrupted. How do you tell someone that their success makes you feel worthless? How do you tell your best friend that you resent him for having everything you wish you could have? I was ashamed of feeling that way, so I never said anything. And the longer I stayed quiet, the worse it got. Elvis understood then that this betrayal was as much about Red's internal struggle as it was about the actual theft. His friend had been drowning in feelings of inadequacy and resentment, and instead of reaching out for help, he had turned to stealing as a way to assert some control over his life. But understanding didn't make the betrayal hurt less. Elvis looked around the meditation room, a space that was supposed to bring peace and clarity, and felt only confusion and sadness. He had lost more than money and possessions. He had lost his trust in one of the most important relationships in his life. What happens now? Red asked, his voice barely audible. Elvis had been dreading this question since he'd discovered the theft. He could call the police and have Red arrested. He could simply fire him and never speak to him again. He could demand restitution and public apology. But none of these options felt right for a situation that went so far beyond simple theft. I don't know, Elvis admitted. I can't pretend this didn't happen. I can't go back to trusting you the way I did before, but I also can't forget 20 years of friendship. They sat in silence for several more minutes, both men crying quietly as they mourned the death of their relationship. Finally, Elvis made his decision. You can't work for me anymore, he said, his voice steady despite his tears. I can't have someone around me that I can't trust completely. My life depends on the people around me being loyal, and you've shown that your loyalty has limits. Red nodded, accepting the judgment without argument. I understand. I know I've lost the right to be here, but I'm not going to have you arrested, Elvis continued, and I'm not going to ruin your reputation by telling people what happened. What you did was wrong. But I remember who you were before this, and I'm choosing to believe that person is still in there somewhere. The mercy in Elvis's response seemed to devastate Red even more than anger might have. Elvis, I'm so sorry. I'm sorrier than I know how to express. I've destroyed the best thing in my life, and I have no one to blame but myself. I know you're sorry, Elvis said, and I forgive you, Red. I don't like what you did, and I can't trust you anymore, but I forgive you. Because that's what friends do. Even when they can't be friends anymore. The conversation continued for another hour, with both men alternating between anger, sadness, and attempts at understanding. They talked about their childhood, about the early days of Elvis's career, about all the good times they had shared. In a way, it felt like a funeral. They were mourning the death of their friendship while celebrating what it had once meant to both of them. When Red finally left Graceland that evening, it was with the understanding that he would never return as an employee or member of the inner circle. Elvis arranged for him to receive a generous severance package, not as payment for stolen goods, but as acknowledgement of the years of legitimate service Red had provided. The theft had ended, but the emotional damage would last much longer. Elvis found himself questioning every relationship, wondering who else might be taking advantage of his generosity and trust. The easy familiarity he had always enjoyed with his staff became more guarded, more careful. He installed installed additional security measures, not just cameras, but also safes and locks that he had previously felt were unnecessary in his own home. More painfully, Elvis struggled with his own judgment. How had he failed to see what was happening? What other betrayals might he be missing? The questions ate at him, making him more isolated and suspicious than he had ever been before. Red West's departure from Elvis's inner circle marked the beginning of the end of the Memphis Mafia. As it had originally existed, the tight-knit group of childhood friends and early supporters began to fracture as Elvis's trust became harder to earn and easier to lose. Other members of the group found themselves under increased scrutiny, their loyalty constantly tested in ways it had never been before. The stolen items were eventually returned, but their sentimental value had been permanently damaged. Elvis's mother's harmonica, once a treasured connection to happier times, now carried the taint of betrayal. He put it away in a safe and rarely looked at it again, unable to separate the memory of his mother from the memory of Red's theft. In the months that followed, Red West attempted several times to rebuild his relationship with Elvis. He wrote letters of apology, reached out through mutual friends, and even showed up at Graceland hoping to speak with Elvis directly. But Elvis, while he had forgiven Red, could never again trust him. The friendship that had survived poverty, fame, marriage, divorce, and countless other challenges could not survive the discovery that Red had been willing to steal from the person who trusted him most. The betrayal changed Elvis in fundamental ways. He became more careful about who he allowed into his inner circle, more suspicious of people's motives, and more protective of both his possessions and his emotions. The easy generosity that had always characterized his relationships became tempered with caution. Yet in some ways, the experience also deepened Elvis's compassion for human weakness. He understood that Red's actions had come from pain and insecurity rather than malice, and that understanding helped him forgive other betrayals he would face in the years to come. He learned that people could love you and still hurt you, that loyalty was more complex than he had previously believed, and that forgiveness was possible even when reconciliation was not. Red West went on to pursue other opportunities in the entertainment industry, but he never again found the kind of close, family-like relationship he had enjoyed with Elvis. In interviews years later, he would describe his theft from Graceland as the biggest mistake of his life, not because of what he had taken, but because of what he had lost. The ripple effects of Red's betrayal extended far beyond just his relationship with Elvis. Other members of the Memphis Mafia found themselves under increased scrutiny. Jerry Schilling and Joe Esposito had to work harder to prove their trustworthiness, knowing that Elvis's faith in his inner circle had been fundamentally shaken. The betrayal also affected Elvis's relationship with his father, Vernon Presley, who began implementing stricter accounting procedures and regular audits of all household expenses. The easy, family-like atmosphere that had characterized Graceland became more business-like and formal. The psychological impact on Elvis was profound and lasting. Dr. George Nichopoulos, Elvis's personal physician, noticed that Elvis began having more frequent nightmares and bouts of insomnia. Following the confrontation with Red, Elvis told me he kept dreaming that everyone around him was stealing from him, Dr. Nick remembered. Perhaps most tragically, the incident affected Elvis's legendary generosity. For years, he had been famous for his spontaneous gifts, giving away cars, jewelry, and large sums of money to friends and strangers. After discovering Red's betrayal, Elvis became more calculated in his generosity, often second-guessing his impulses to give. The incident also highlighted the complex power dynamics that existed within Elvis's inner circle. Many of the Memphis Mafia members were financially dependent on Elvis, creating an unbalanced relationship where loyalty was both freely given and financially motivated. When Elvis died in 1977, Red was not among the pallbearers or speakers at the funeral. He watched from the crowd outside Graceland, separated by his own actions from the farewell to his oldest friend. In his later writings and interviews, he consistently described his betrayal of Elvis's trust as the defining regret of his life. The story of Elvis and Red West serves as a painful reminder that even the closest relationships can be complicated by jealousy, insecurity, and poor judgment. It shows us that forgiveness is possible even in the face of deep betrayal, but that some actions have consequences that can never be fully undone. For Elvis, the experience reinforced his belief in the importance of loyalty while teaching him that trust, once broken, is nearly impossible to fully repair. He continued to surround himself with friends and employees, but never again with the complete openness and vulnerability that had characterized his relationship with Red. The meditation room at Graceland, where the confrontation took place, remained one of Elvis's favorite spaces in the house. He would often retreat there when dealing with difficult decisions or personal conflicts, perhaps remembering the afternoon when he had to choose between justice and mercy, between punishment and forgiveness. Today, visitors to Graceland can see many of the rooms where Elvis lived and entertained. But the meditation room remains private, as does the surveillance room where Elvis first discovered his friend's betrayal. These spaces hold memories too personal and painful for public consumption, reminders of the human cost of fame and the complexity of relationships built around celebrity and wealth. The story of Red West's betrayal is not just about theft, it's about the corrosive effects of unaddressed resentment, the difficulty of maintaining authentic relationships in the face of extreme inequality, and the challenge of separating love from loyalty. It reminds us that even kings can be wounded by those they trust most, and that some heartbreaks leave scars that never fully heal. In the end, Elvis's handling of Red's betrayal revealed as much about his character as the betrayal itself revealed about Red's, faced with evidence that could have destroyed his former friend. Elvis chose mercy over vengeance, understanding over anger. It was perhaps one of his most kingly acts, not because it demonstrated power, but because it demonstrated wisdom, compassion, and the strength to forgive, even when he could not forget. That August day in 1974, Elvis discovered that even the people we trust most can betray us, and that forgiveness doesn't always mean reconciliation. He chose mercy over vengeance, showing us that true strength lies not in punishing those who wrong us, but in understanding the pain that drives them to wrong us in the first place. The friendship between Elvis and Red West couldn't survive the betrayal, but Elvis's capacity for forgiveness grew stronger because of it. If this story resonated with you, remember that we all face moments when trust is broken and relationships are tested. Subscribe to Elvis Presley Legacy, stories to discover more moments when the King showed us how to handle life's most difficult challenges with grace and dignity. Share this story with someone who needs to remember that betrayal, while painful, doesn't have to destroy our ability to love and trust again.